Greetings, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for such a wonderful first week of class. It's hard to believe that it's already over. There's a lot of things that I want to share and talk about, and so these announcements are largely going to be somewhat of a summary, somewhat of a synthesis, as well as somewhat of an anticipation of what is to come for this following week, understanding that because most of you finished reading and posting reviews on Friday, you've probably already started with the next book, which under these conditions would be Serpent King. But I would like to be able to at least provide you with some sort of synthesis, because I think you put a lot of really hard work into your reviews, and there were a lot of really wonderful thoughts that I would like to be able to sort of highlight and share, and also pull together some of those ideas. I also really appreciated the fact that you did such a nice job with your with your reviews and not providing spoilers. You did a great job with that, as well as thinking pretty deeply with the identity piece. And so you did a great job, I think, of trying to be as theoretical as well as just provide some honest thoughts about the texts, which I thought was really wonderful as well, and I really appreciated that. So the first thing I want to do is just sort of share a few thoughts based on the things that you shared in the GoodReads post. The first one is from Madison, and it says, Xiomara's view of the world reminded me of life at 16 and how much strain there is at that time just to find your space in the world. Her struggles with her relationships with herself, her peers, her family, and her religion felt very authentic and moving. And that was one thing that I thought I felt too. That was something that resonated with me as I was going through this text, because there was something about Acevedo's words and the way that she was able to capture her feelings around Xiomara and the way she built that character out through such beautiful language that I thought was really powerful. Chris provided a critique. One thing that I always told you, or I told you in the beginning, is that I'm always interested in looking at different and dissenting views. Chris was, to be fair, largely glowing of the text itself, but his comment was, my only critique is that there were some instances where the dialogue did not feel very realistic, so much so that it pulled me out of the story a little bit. And I think that's really important. It's important that an author, a YA author in particular, a young adult author, captures the thoughts and feelings of youth, of that particular age. And so I think it's really valuable that an author does an authentic job of doing that. It's a reason why I cannot read John Green, because I didn't meet any teenagers when I was a teacher who spoke in the ways that his characters did. And it was very hard for me to believe that. However, I had a lot of students who loved John Green because I think they like to believe that that's the way they spoke when they were speaking with their friends. And so that is tricky. When the language doesn't feel authentic, that can make it a bit difficult. Another point that I want to bring up, and this is sort of pulling it back to the identity piece, which is identity is such a complex and fragile thing to navigate, especially independently and introspectively in one's teen years. Through Xiomara's illustrative retelling of her experiences, however, I think many adolescents could feel as if though they were actually being understood by someone struggling with their similar problems. And that came from Darian. And I think that's a great point, is that texts like these are supposed to be friends. They're supposed to be companions. They're supposed to help young people navigate and negotiate their experiences as they're going through them. And so I think this was a really nice way of pointing that out. And it brought me into, as sort of a segue here, a short segue into the Coates reading. I thought Coates did a nice job of providing this notion of identity. As I mentioned on the first day of class, I didn't think that this was a chapter necessarily, a keyword that was only going to relate specifically to the poet X. I think we will return to identity throughout this entire session. However, I think it's worth pointing out that two definitions that Coates provides are, the first one here, identity is usually thought of as developmental and is entirely dependent on the influence of variables such as race, culture, religion, family, ideology, and embodiment. And I thought that really captured the text itself, right? Like, I think that's a pretty strong encapsulation of what Xiomara was experiencing. This balance between race, culture, religion, we know was huge. Family, because of religion, ideology, as well as embodiment, and that notion of body, and what are our bodies made for, and the experience of body, the changing body, the male gaze on the female body. It just kept coming up again and again. And so I'm not sure necessarily that I agree. I don't necessarily subscribe to just this developmental notion of identity, as if we are always developing body or developing culture in this teleological way, right? Like this notion that eventually, through this process of coming of age, we arrive at what our identity actually is. And there's also this other piece here in the second definition provided by Coates. In postmodern culture, identity is no longer conceived as something one achieves through looking inward for the eternal, unchanging truth of oneself, but instead emerges at the nexus of a set of discourses of race, gender, ethnicity, class, and so on, that one uses with degrees of submissiveness or subversion to fashion a provisional performance of the self. And that part I mean, those of you who've had me know that I'm a card-carrying postmodern member, right? Like I certainly subscribe to this. And this belief that in many cases, identity is performative, right? That there isn't necessarily a stable self from within that we are trying to discover through these experiences engaging with others. And so I actually tend to subscribe to this second definition, but that first piece of that developmental notion and those examples that were provided, I think are important, but it's the entanglement with those discourses that I think matters a tremendous lot here. And so one last piece that I will point out about the keyword section here is just pay close attention each week. Each week as you're reading these different keywords, they're crafted differently. I like the way that Coates organized hers. So you saw that there was this beginning piece here where she did a nice job of providing some context through definitions and thinkers from different fields, including sociology and philosophy, as a way to foreground what she means by identity, right? And so she took definitions from different spaces, different thinkers, different fields, and said, this is what everyone seems to think about identity. And then she provides two examples. One was from 10 Things I Hate About Me. The other one was The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian. And she sees just very quickly, she provides like this very quick overview of what identity meant in those two particular texts. And so she gives the overview of what she means by identity, what other people have meant by identity, how do authors try to respond to these really important philosophical questions, what does that look like in children's literature, or in both cases here, young adult literature. And so use these as models if you are planning on doing the keyword for your final, because I think this provides a really good example. The other piece here that I think is really important is just as we're looking at the way different people responded to text, it's important because we have a video we'll be watching this week by Grace Lin, and it is all about these windows and mirrors of young adult literature. And so there were two examples that I wanted to highlight that sort of looked at what these texts can mean as far as a window and a mirror. So this is a little bit of a taste of what Grace Lin is going to be talking about in her video. The first comment I want to highlight is from Ben. Ben says, as a white guy living in Montana, I have to accept that there is an inherent distance between these stories and my own experience. Our lives are vastly different, which makes a novel like this all the more important to read. And so you'll see Grace talk about that in a little bit when she talks about books as windows into other people's experiences. And then Jonathan here also mentioned, as Xiomara's identity is shaped by things both in and out of her control, I found myself remembering how those tumultuous years felt for me. Even though my personal identity is vastly different, some things will be the same for all young people as they grow up. And so Jonathan's talking about here, I think, this really beautiful point of Xiomara, this Dominican girl living in Harlem, has these experiences which perhaps don't align necessarily with Jonathan's upbringing, but there are moments, there's these shared experiences of what it was like to be a teen and growing up and going to high school and having crushes that so many of us can relate to. And so there's something about this where even though the identities might have been different between Jonathan and Xiomara, there's also this notion that there is a mirror there, something that resonates that Jonathan saw in himself in Xiomara, or at least her experiences. And so I think that's really important. Grace Lynn will flesh these out a little bit more for us. Just a few more points. I promise I won't go on much longer. So we are going to be watching that video. I hope that that provided just a little bit of a taste of what to expect from Grace Lynn. You will be reading a section by Tally on young adult. And so I would suggest reading that earlier on so that it provides you with a little bit of a lens or something for you to look for, some ideas to search through as you're reading Serpent King, because that is our text this week. And there are just a few things I realized as you were talking, like through your reviews, many of you were like, I didn't know what to expect from the Poet-X. And for good reason. I didn't do a good job of sort of anticipating or book talking that particular text. And so I want to very quickly book talk the Serpent King for you because I want you to, I'm sure most of you who have probably already started reading the Serpent King. It's much longer than the Poet-X, and it will take you probably much longer to get through. So I'm hopeful that most of you have started. But for those of you who haven't, my little book talk for this is that it follows three characters, Dillard Early, and then we have his friends Lydia and Travis. And even though it does shift perspectives and shifts focus between those three characters, I think y'all will all agree with me that Dill is the main character of the Serpent King. He is in many ways the namesake of the text itself. And so this book does explore young adulthood in a rural town. That rural town is not in Montana. It is in Forestville, Tennessee, which is a town outside of Nashville. And so it explores rurality and explores what it's like to grow up in these very small parochial spaces. And certainly the theme of how do I get out of my one-horse town is explored quite a lot. And so I think that's something that I'm interested in seeing. For those of you who come from small rural towns, you'll have to tell us. Is there a fair portrayal of this particular experience? It's a southern rural town, which means it's not the same thing as a small town necessarily in Montana, but I'm interested in hearing people's perspectives and their reactions to specific characters. And this discourse of the only way to sort of survive the experience in a small rural town is to get the hell out of there, right? Like, because it's a trap. And that's something that goes back and forth, and that experience of what home means. And so I'm interested to get your perspectives as you're reading that. And so one last thing I will do is give you just a quick quote that I think will at least whet your appetite or at least get you into the text, which says, "Remember this, Dillard Early," Lydia whispered, her voice cracking. You are you, and you are magnificent and brilliant and talented. You're not your grandfather. You're not your father. Their serpents are not your serpents. Their poison is not your poison. Their darkness is not your darkness. Not even their name is your name. And so I'm interested to see the way we are able to explore these different texts, this darkness, because it is a little bit of a darker book at times, but there are a lot of themes that you will see that are familiar. And so I'm going to try to do my best to sort of capture some big keywords and ideas this semester. You'll see in the left-hand column here, the Poet-X. I'm coming up with keywords that you may want to sort of explore. You may want to keep a list of things that are really catching your attention so that you can make those connections between different texts in the way that Coates did with 10 Things I Hate About Me and The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian. And so notice how if you can sort of talk about 2 different texts, 3 different texts, pull them together in your final keywords paper, it would be a nice way of being able to make those connections pretty easily and draw from examples. And so my examples you can see for the Poet-X are here. And just to give you some thoughts and ideas from the Serpent King, a lot of you mentioned religion. I would say that faith maybe is perhaps even a stronger keyword for the Serpent King. And there are also things with regard to parents and very different parental relationships. Sort of overarching, this notion of class is connected to parental relationships with youth. And certainly there is that connection of love too. You will see love rear its beautiful its beautiful head throughout these YA, these young adult literature texts throughout this entire semester. So I hope that this has helped clarify a few questions. I hope I've done a decent job of synthesizing your thoughts. I hope I haven't put you to sleep. Thank you for those of you who've made it to the end of this video. I will see you next week. If you have any questions about the Serpent King as you're reading this week, please do not hesitate to reach out. Y'all have a good one. Enjoy reading.